Thank you. Right, welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to be here to MC today's Monday Lunch Live session. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders and families past, present and emerging. So today's special edition of the VCCC Monday Lunch Live. I'm sure that you're all aware of the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre. It's a powerful alliance of 10 successful Victorian organisations committed to cancer control. And as part of the VCCC mission, education is a core component, and we're very happy to have Professor Christine Friedenreich with us today to present. Now, Christine was actually my postdoctoral, I was a postdoctoral fellow in Christine's group, and it was almost 10 years exactly to the day. I think it was mid-October when I moved to Calgary back in, it was 2009, yes. So really excited to have Christine with us in Melbourne. Christine has multiple appointments. Her primary appointment is as the Scientific Director of the Department of Cancer Epidemiology and Prevention Research at Alberta Health Services. Christine has appointments at the University of Calgary, and she's the new chair of the Scientific Council for the International Agency for Research in Cancer. So today, Christine will cover the research that she's led with a big team of investigators across Canada. And she'll be presenting findings from the COMPARE study, a 5-year-long project that examined the proportion of cancers that were attributable to different modifiable risk factors. So Christine, welcome up to the stage, and I'll hand over to you and we'll take some questions at the end.
Thanks very much, Bridget. I didn't realize it was a full 10 years since I first had Bridget come to Calgary. And I was telling someone I have very strong sort of maternal connections to Australia, because I also had the great pleasure of helping supervise Dr. Anne Cust, who was also here in Melbourne for part of her postdoctoral training when she was doing a co-tutel program at the University of Sydney along with the Université de Lyon, when I was a visiting scientist in Lyon in 2004 and 5. So I've got these nice connections with Australian epidemiologists, and was very happy to be able to come back and spend some time. I've just been in Sydney visiting with Anne, and now here in Bridget with her team. So I'm very much looking forward to these couple of days that I have here. So, as Bridget said, I'm going to be talking to you about a large study that we have just completed this year. It's actually just winding up right now at the end of October, that we called the COMPARE study, which stood for the Canadian Population Attributable Risk of Cancer Study. So I just want to acknowledge that this study had a very large pan-Canadian team, and here on this slide you can see the co-principal investigator with me was Dr. Darren Brenner, based out of the University of Calgary with Alberta Health Services. And the way we designed this study is that we had different, what we call nodes across Canada that were focused on different aspects of the project. So in Calgary, we were looking at all of the lifestyle risk factors. Based out of McGill University was the team led by Dr. Eduardo Franco, looking at the infectious agents in cancer. And then there was a team based out of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, that was looking at all the environmental risk factors. That it was led by Dr. Will King. And he was supported by Dr. Paul Demers from Cancer Care Ontario and Dr. Paul Villeneuve from Carleton University in Ottawa. And then we also had a knowledge translation team that was based out of the Canadian Cancer Society in Toronto that also had work. Some of the individuals were also based at Cancer Care Ontario in Toronto. This study was funded by the Canadian Cancer Society, and it was a cancer prevention partnership grant, and so a large component of this study involved an integrated knowledge translation component, which I'll be going into in detail. And the only other thing I want to point out is that the Canadian Cancer Society also funded an occupational burden of cancer study that was led by Dr. Paul Demers, that was funded the year before we started. And Dr. Demers' project was then merged with ours at the end so that we could then combine all of the data that we had on occupational, environmental, infectious agents, and lifestyle risk factors. So just starting off with some of the statistics for Canada, and these are compiled by the Statistics Canada. We have population-based cancer registries in Canada that send all of their data to Statistics Canada, and these are published on an annual basis. So the most recent statistics that we had for 2017 was that we had over 200,000 Canadians are diagnosed with cancer annually, and out of those we have about 80,000 deaths. And 30% of deaths in Canada in 2012 were due to cancer. So our current statistics, which are I think similar to here in Australia, so we say 1 in 2 Canadians will develop cancer in their lifetime, and 1 in 4 will die from cancer. Before we did the Compare project, we did a similar study in Alberta that we called the Population Attributable Risk Study in Alberta, and we worked with our partners from the Alberta Cancer Prevention Legacy Fund. So this was a group of scientists and individuals who were interested in developing programs for cancer prevention, and they were very interested in having some data on what the current attributable risks for cancer were in Canada. And so this study was done in 2013-14, and this is one of the main infographics that we had that was inspired by the work that had been done by Cancer Research UK, led by Max Parkin and his colleagues. And during this year that we were doing this study, the Canadian Cancer Society launched its competition for the Canadian Partnership grants, and so we were then able to get funding, which extended just into this year for this Cancer Prevention Partnership grant. And as I said, one of the requirements of this grant was that we had to work with partners at the Canadian Cancer Society. And so this was the first time in my career that I had an embedded, integrated knowledge translation component in the study. And when I was in Sydney just recently, people said here in Australia, you don't use the words knowledge translation as much as we do in Canada, but in Canada it's now become very much a part of all the grants that we have to write, is to acknowledge how are we going to think about putting research into practice. And there are 2 kinds of KT that we often talk about. Integrated KT is when you're actually working with KT specialists doing the project and trying to change the study or make some design elements that evolve over time with the advice of a KT advisory group, which is what we had. And then there's always end of study KT as well, which is the sort of normal study, end of study kind of dissemination that a lot of scientists do in presenting their research findings in publications and doing scientific presentations. So this is an overview of what the Compare study was all about. We were thinking about the past burden of cancer and how that influences current burden. We were thinking about how prevention strategies might influence then future burden, and what avoidable burden of cancer we might be able to think about. The time period that we used was 2015 for cancer incidence, and we went up to 2042. We originally started at 2012, and then during the study we had new cancer incidence data that allowed us to go up to 2015, but we still projected out to 2042, which was 30 years into the future. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the past burden. So as many of you may know, there's been a lot of success in the past from some of the primary prevention interventions that have been done, and the classic example that we all know about is with smoking and lung cancer rates. So these are data for Canadian men and women, and you can see here how the crude rate of lung cancer has gone down over time with changes in tobacco prevalence within the population, looking at this by younger and older age groups. We've also had a lot of success in secondary prevention. Here are some examples for cervical cancer. In Canada, and I imagine here too, we've had a lot of success with pap smear screening, as well as with HPV vaccination. But there's also a lot of opportunity for prevention still. These are data for kidney cancer, and as you can see in Canada, our kidney cancer rates are going up quite dramatically, particularly amongst younger populations, and this can be linked to obesity, which is a strong risk factor for kidney cancer. So when we were thinking about the COMPARE project and we're thinking about the current burden of cancer, we had to think about how exposures in the past actually influence the cancer incidence that we have now. So to do this kind of research on population attributable risk, there are a number of different components that we have to think about. We need to know what the cancer incidence in the population is. We need to know what the risk estimates are that we're going to be looking at for different cancer exposure associations. And we also need to think about the prevalence of the exposure in the population. You can see this very simple formula at the bottom, which is Levine's formula that's been used quite a lot over many decades, is the way to estimate population attributable risk. And then we can also think about the excess attributable risk, which is essentially just the population attributable risk multiplied by the number of incident cancer cases. So these are the primary factors that we looked at. We did actually publish our methods paper in BMJ Open, so if anybody's very interested in knowing more of the details of our methods, that is in that paper. So when we started off looking at the risk factors that we might want to include in this study, we had a long list of factors that we were interested in, and these are the ones that we ended up being able to do so. So there were some risk factors that we were not able to include in the end because we just did not have data either from a risk estimate. Usually the risk estimate was okay, but generally it was from the prevalence of exposure from a nationally representative sample of Canadians. So this is what we've ended up looking at. So to be able to figure out which exposure cancer associations we were interested in looking at in this study, we decided that we needed to develop a hierarchy for the kind of evidence that we could extract. And so we started off with the IARC monographs on the evaluation of carcinogenic risks to humans. And so for those of you who may not know, the International Agency for Research on Cancer is well known for doing very outstanding systematic reviews of all of the literature on different cancer risk factors and publishing excellent reviews and also classifying these carcinogens according to a classification system. And so a group 1 carcinogen is one that we considered, and as well as a group 2A, which is a probably carcinogenic to humans. If we did not have that kind of level of evidence that we could go at, we then went to the World Cancer Research Fund, which is also a very authoritative group based out of London, UK. And they work with the Imperial College London, and they do continuous updates of the literature, particularly on lifestyle risk factors and cancer. And they also have ways of classifying the evidence. And so if there was evidence for convincing or probable evidence of an association, we were able to include those risk factors. If there were risk factors that we were interested in looking at that hadn't been considered by IARC or WCRF, then we looked for meta-analyses or pooled analyses where we could find consistently statistically significant results. And finally, particularly for some of the environmental risk factors, if there was really nothing available from the literature, then we conducted our own meta-analyses to make sure that we were able to include those factors. We also needed to have information on exposure. And so here we tried to find nationally representative surveys that have been done in Canada for the risk factors we were looking at. For some of them, like the Canadian Health Measures Survey, that was quite useful because those was a survey that involved direct measurements of populations using things like accelerometers, which measure movement, and also doing direct measurements of anthropometric measurements like body size. We also had the Canadian Community Health Survey, which is an ongoing survey that's done in Canada that regularly collects a lot of information on different risk factors. And then we have a cohort study in Canada called the Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow Project that has now 330,000 Canadians from 5 different regions in the country that have been included in this cohort. And so for some of the risk factors, we were able to get some cohort data from that. And then for things like UV exposure, we had specific surveys that we were able to look at. So for cancer, and for I imagine all of you know this already, we know that there are long latency periods between the time of an exposure and the time of a cancer actually being detected. And so ideally, In this kind of research, you would like to know, when the exposure was initiated, what this, latency period is between that initiation of exposure and the tumor detection. But in reality, we do not have any information about when exposure has been initiated, but we have some time point where we do go about and measure an exposure, and then we know about when the tumor is detected. So this measured latency period is the period that we were able to use in our studies. So when we were able to find in the literature what that latency period actually was, that's what we used to model the data on exposure that we used for our population attributable risk estimates. But if we didn't have that information, we used generally a latency period of about 12 years between exposure measurement and tumor detection. We also needed to have some baseline estimates that we used for our prevention targets when we were thinking about these associations. And so for each risk factor that we had, we set what we would consider the reference category, shall we say, where the ideal situation where there would be no risk or a lower risk associated with that exposure. So these are just giving some examples for physical activity, alcohol intake, weight, and fruit and vegetable intake. So we went about doing all of this work over several years and came up with these results. So I'm going to be showing you a series of slides working with our knowledge translation group. We did a number of consultations with the KT advisory team, and they also helped formulate exactly the associations that we were going to be looking at and the kinds of preventable fractions that we would be modeling for future exposure. So this is a summary slide that shows the number of cancer cases that could be attributable to all of these different risk factors that we looked at. So you can see that of course, the largest associations we know come with smoking and cancer, and so the large number of attributable cancer cases, nearly 33,000 for 2015, were because of active smoking, and then secondhand smoke is also a smaller number, 1,400. But lack of physical activity, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in, it was also very important, with nearly 12,000 cases attributed to it. Low fruit intake, excess body weight, also very important, sun exposure, HPV, and other infections. So all in all, we had some very interesting results here. We also, we have a number of different ways that we looked at these data, and here is a graph that shows you by cancer site what all of the attributable fractions were for each of the main risk factors that we looked at. And so you can see for some cancer sites, we have 82%, for example, for lung cancer, that can be attributable to modifiable risk factors. And that goes down to 22% for pancreatic cancer, 23% for breast cancer. So you can see ranging between 22 and 82%, a large percentage of cancers can actually be prevented. And what's interesting, of course, too, is that the underlying causes, of course, are quite different by cancer site. So that's why it's important to consider each cancer site individually. When we did a large media campaign when this study came out on the 8th of May, and and we did a focus on excess body weight, which I understand is also an interest here at the Victoria Cancer Center. And so here we show all of the cancers that are, and population attributable risks that were found for excess body size. So as you can see, there are actually a large number of cancers that are associated with excess body size, and it's up to nearly 30% for things like esophageal adenocarcinoma and endometrial cancer, and going to under 5% for things like ovarian cancer. The main infographic that we produced for our study is this one here, and we tried in this one to summarize the main findings from the study. So one of the big take-home messages was that nearly 4 in 10 cancers could be prevented through healthy lifestyle and policies that protect the health of Canadians, and that about 70,000 cancer cases could have been prevented in 2015 if we didn't have all of these exposures. So what you see in this infographic is that the size of the circle is proportional to the number of cancer cases that could be prevented. So of course we've got tobacco here with the largest number, and then again physical inactivity, excess weight, low fruit, sun, and going all the way down to indoor tanning. Another way that we can look at these data is with this bar graph. Here we stacked the different kinds of exposures that were associated with each different cancer site. So again, here for lung cancer, you can see occupational exposures, radon, air pollution, low fruit, low vegetable, physical inactivity, secondhand smoke, and tobacco. And what we can see that's very interesting is that for some of the cancers like lung cancer, head and neck cancer, stomach cancers, very, very high percentages of these cancers are potentially preventable. Of course, the most exciting here is cervical cancer, where we know that 100% of cervical cancer is associated with HPV exposure and secondhand smoke and tobacco. So it's actually the most preventable cancer sites that we can look at. Again, this is another way that we displayed the results, which is just showing, again, the percentage of cancers that were due to the risk factors themselves, and this is collapsing it across all cancer sites combined. So we have, again, for smoking as the highest at around 17–18%, and indoor tanning at less than 1%. And so we did include the diesel engine exhaust, like all the occupational exposures in here as well. So even though this study was done separately from ours, at the end we did combine all of the results. So another way that we developed a website for this study. It's called www.prevent.cancer.ca. It's available in English and in French. And so we have a number of infographics. I think we have over 180 that we developed for this study. And so we thought of all sorts of different ways of displaying this information, because we recognize that the study results would be used by cancer agencies across the country, and they might have specific questions that they'd be interested in. So all of the analyses were done by province, by sex, and by age group, by risk factor, and by cancer. So we had masses and masses of analyses that we did, and so that allowed us to do these kinds of histograms. So what you can see here are for the cancers due to excess body weight for men and women, and here for sedentary behavior for men and women, and it shows it the data by age group as well. So you can see here, this is for females, starting at the lowest age groups and up to the highest. And these are some other ones for alcohol and for human papillomavirus. So this is, what we were talking about with 100% for cervical cancer. And also very interesting here are the number of cancers that are attributable to alcohol, and the associations being particularly strong here for breast cancer and colon and rectal cancers and oral cancers amongst men. Another way we displayed the results were creating these exposure-specific infographics, which could then also be used if there was a particular campaign that was focused on, for example, improving physical activity or reducing radon in homes. Radon is a problem in Canada. I'm not sure that is as much of an issue here, but you can actually get radon exposure right from the bedrock in under houses. But it is something that is quite easily mitigated, and so it's an exposure that we have a lot of interest in Canada because of its association with lung cancer. So here, for example, for physical activity, we did some very short and snappy little types of sayings for each of the exposures. Like here, the message was move more to reduce your cancer risk. We know that 7 out of 10 Canadians are not physically active. We do know that physical activity is related to a number of different cancer sites, and that nearly 12,000 cases in 2015 were associated with physical inactivity, and then this number was going to increase to 16,500 by 2042. So these infographics combine the current and future burden information, which I'm going to show you in a second. And these are some of the cancer-specific infographics that we developed. So we did this for each cancer site that we looked at. And this comes again, these pie charts are something that we displayed on the dashboard that we created for this study. And so you can have all the information for each cancer site in one infographic like this, which is also quite useful from a prevention planning perspective. We also looked at the differences across Canada by region. So we do know that within Canada there are very large differences in some of the exposures to some of these risk factors. For example, for tobacco exposure, it's still extremely high in Quebec compared to other provinces like British Columbia, which I think is closer to what you have here in Australia at about 10% prevalence, or even 10 to 15%. Excess body weight, again, is unevenly distributed in the country, with very high rates in our northern territories and in some in central Canada and in the Atlantic provinces as well. So now we're going to think about the future burden. As I mentioned before, we were interested not only in what the current burden was, but also thinking about what burden of cancer we could potentially avoid if we changed the exposure to some of these risk factors. So to be able to estimate the future burden, we needed to think about the preventable impact fraction. And to be able to do that, we needed to know the projected cancer incidence, the projected distribution of the exposure, the counterfactual distributions of the exposure, as well as the risk estimates. So, and with the counterfactual distributions, we could think of a number of different scenarios, and I'll be showing you some of those scenarios here for a future. So to be able to do this, as I mentioned, we needed to be able to project into the future what we expected the prevalence of all of these risk factors to be. And so we used the data that we had from the past, and we projected it forward into the future. So here you can see the projections for males and females for physical activity, and the groups that we had fairly broad categories of inactive, moderately active, and active. And what we're showing over time is the number of, for example here, the number of inactive men was projected to go down, and active men to go up, and the moderately active also to go up, and something a little bit similar with females. We also had to do some cancer incidence projections, and here we were using a model called CanProj, which is similar to the NordPred models that are used actually by IARC to do some of their cancer incidence projections. And so we did this for each cancer site. We thought about what the right model was for future cancer projections. So on this graph, you can see these are the age standardized rates that in these dotted lines. And so the darker lines are what we actually had as data going up to 2012. And then the number of actual cases are in the dark bars, and the lighter bars are the projected number of cases. And similarly here for men and women separately. And so we used a combination of looking at the past incidence curves. We worked with the rest of our team and thinking about which exact model was the best one that we should choose for each one of these cancer sites. And so you can see these are examples for lung cancer, kidney cancer. So lung cancer was going down, kidney cancer was projected to keep going up. And I think I should also point out, though, even with the lung cancer incidence rates projected to go down, the actual number of cases over time would still go up, because Canada, like Australia, is a country of immigrants, and we also have an aging population. So we expect the actual number of cases to continue increasing. And even more so for something like renal cell carcinoma. So what we then were able to do, again, for all of these different risk factors, was to project forward in time the number of actual cases that we were expected to occur by exposure. So this is a shot from our website, from the dashboard. And what you can see here is in the blue bars here, these are the actual number of cases that were attributed to each one of these risk factors in 2019, and then going forward to 2042, what we were expecting to see. So again, we have very high numbers for tobacco, but also for physical activity and body size. Actually, this was body size and physical activity, and sedentary behavior and so on. So here is an example of the more detailed analyses that we would then do for the preventable impact fraction. This is for excess weight. And so what we did was we modeled a number of counterfactual scenarios for each one of these risk factors. And depending on what the risk factor was, we were able to review the literature and think about other interventions that have been done where they actually were able to show a reduction in the prevalence of an exposure by a certain amount, or we used some evidence from like community-based interventions, or then we also just set targets based on some, like the World Cancer Research Fund or WHO or whatever, that had set targets for some of these risk factors. So we used a combination of different things. We also used what we called aspirational counterfactuals. So we sometimes said, okay, well, what would happen if we had a 10%, 25, or 50% reduction in the exposure? So here, for example, for BMI, you can see that with a 25% reduction in exposure, the annual preventable cases could go up to 15,000. And so we estimated it on an annual basis, but we also looked at it on a cumulative basis. So over this 27-year time period from 2015 to 2042, what would be the number of cases that could potentially be prevented over that time period? And so here you can see that just for excess body weight, we had over 110,000 cancers that were potentially preventable. And this is, of course, looking at all associated cancers. And this is for smoking. So we also looked at a number of different scenarios here as well. And some of these were, related to things like, increases in cost for cigarettes, or just reducing the prevalence by a small amount or even much larger amounts. So we had, as I said, a number of different ways of looking at this. And this is for alcohol. As I mentioned, the WCRF has a certain guidelines, and the Canadian guidelines are a little bit different from the WCRF guidelines. And so they were all ways of thinking about the future. And we felt that we needed to be somewhat responsive to outside agencies as well, and not just be thinking about what the Canadian guidelines have been. So this is a shot from our actual website, and you can see on the website in the dashboard, we have, you can look at the current future burden data, but also the occupational cancer data. And what is possible with this dashboard is that you can actually modify how these data are presented, and these data can also be all downloaded. So you can look at the annual and the cumulative numbers of cases that can be associated with any specific cancer type for any different part of Canada. It can be done by province and by sex. And we can run through all of these different scenarios, and you can see by year exactly how many cancer cases would be prevented at any given time point. So this slide here summarizes the projected number of cancer cases that would be preventable in 2042 based on what we called modest, moderate, and aspirational intervention scenarios. And so, as I mentioned, for each one of these cancer sites, we set out some possible, like quite modest intervention scenarios. So those would be the ones in green, and then some more moderate ones are the ones in blue, and then the aspirational ones would be some fairly aggressive intervention scenarios, like up to, let's say, 50% reductions in some of these exposures. So as you can see, for some of the cancer sites, it would make quite a large difference. Another thing that we did on our dashboard were these displays. So this is, again, an interactive dashboard. And so what happens here is when you click onto this part of the dashboard, it'll light up from by year the number of cancer cases that would be preventable. And this circle gets populated by these little people, and each one of these people represent 500 preventable male or female cancer cases. And then by the end, by 2042, it gives you the cumulative sum of the number of cancer cases that could be prevented. And here it is for sedentary behavior, and this is for radon. So now I'm just going to summarize some of the key findings, since we have quite a lot of numbers that we've shown you. This is sort of our overall summary infographic of that 4 in 10 cancer cases could be prevented, and really thinking about it through a combination of both lifestyle changes, healthy living, but also policies that could protect the health of Canadians. In 2015, we had 187,000 cancer cases that were diagnosed, and we estimated that over 70,000 of those could be prevented through decreasing the exposure of these risk factors. And we also estimated that if the current risk factors prevalence trends continued, the number of preventable cases would rise to over 111,000 cases by 2042. Smoking was the leading preventable cause of cancer in Canada, as it is in most places in the world, and that right after that was physical inactivity, and then excess body weight, low fruit, sun exposure, HPV, and low vegetables and alcohol intake, and then some other infections. Again, as I said, we had a focus for our media campaign on maintaining a healthy body weight. And so what we pointed out here is by 2042, that excess body weight would be the second leading preventable cause of cancer after smoking if we don't make changes to our levels of obesity, which represents a very large number of cancer cases that could be prevented by 2042. And then, as we pointed out before, the most preventable cancers were cancers of the cervix, lung, and head and neck, with this bar chart that I showed you before. So as I mentioned, there was a very large component of knowledge translation in this study. So we developed a website for the study, and it's listed there at the bottom in the English and French. It includes this a little video that the Canadian Cancer Society developed. We were very fortunate in this study to work with the CCS. They had a very well-established communications team who helped develop some of the products that we did for this study. We worked with one of their graphic designers to produce all of these infographics. We have a blog that's going to be maintained on an ongoing basis after the study launch, which happened this spring. We have what we call a Champions Toolkit, because we worked very closely with all of the divisions of the Canadian Cancer Society across Canada and a number of other non-governmental organizations and other charities to talk about the results of the study and how they could use these results within their own agencies. And the data dashboard, as I pointed out to you, is really available for any researchers or anybody who's interested in using some of the data for their own purposes, because these are available online. And we've completed the current dashboard, and the future dashboard and the occupational dashboard are nearly complete as well, so they'll be coming online soon too. We were able to publish all of the results of this study at once in a special issue of Preventive Medicine. There were 17 articles, including the editorial, that were published simultaneously. And we have 4 other published papers that explain the methods that we used for this study, and some other ancillary analyses that were done. And all of these papers are available through our website and can be downloaded because we made them all open access. So, I think I can't emphasize enough that having such an integrated knowledge translation component in this study ended up being very, very important. And I think quite often as researchers, we do our research and we publish a paper, and then that's the end of it. But with this study, we were really pushed to think about all the time, how are these results going to be used? And we worked with the KT Advisory Committee. We had the KT Node individuals who were involved with us on the study team, We met with them on a monthly basis. We met yearly as an entire team, and we really worked through all of these components ourselves. So it's ended up being a really good partnership, and one that has resulted in a lot of products beyond what we had originally thought we would do just as a bunch of researchers. So I just want to acknowledge all the people who were involved in the study from across Canada in the various nodes, and the funders for the project. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have on this study. Thanks for your attention. Don't be shy.
Christine, wonderful. And the knowledge transfer part is what I'm really interested in to know more about. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, we all kind of think we do it, but it sounds like there's a much more structured system in Canada to really embed that throughout. So I guess I'm keen to understand a little more about the establishment of the teams, the kinds of skills they might have, and how do you get that in place when you don't have a structure that's formalised? Mm-hmm. If you can share a little bit more about
Yeah, absolutely. So when this particular grant was set up, we had to partner with the Canadian Cancer Society. That was a requirement. But there are people who are knowledge translation specialists, and I don't know how many of those exist in Australia. We don't have that many people with those kinds of skill sets in Canada, but it's become a requirement for all of our grants to have a knowledge translation component in it. And it's not enough to say that we're going to just, publish the papers and submit, abstracts to conferences. And so I think it's been very helpful to have worked with them. What we did is, we wrote some of it into the grant, but really it was something that evolved over the time of the study. And the KT node established this advisory committee. And so we met with the advisory committee about 3 times during the project. And Darren Brenner and I went to Toronto where they had the meetings, and we would present the results of the study and really ask them, how are you going to use these results and what would be a benefit for you? And so out of that came all of these different sort of so-called products that they wanted to have. And the Canadian Cancer Society has a very strong health policy group, and they were very, very well linked into government, NGOs at all different levels. And so when it came to disseminating the results of the study, they had this massive media campaign that went really all around the world, and they got the results out, and we had millions of people pick up on the project as a result because of their very professional communications team. So it involved not only the knowledge translation group, but also the communications people who had a lot of experience in disseminating this kind of information. Using and developing all of these infographics, which I ended up putting a lot of them in here for you because I think it's a way of showing the results from a study that involves masses and masses and masses amount of data, but simplifying it into a way that's quite approachable for a general audience was very important. And the little video that they produced was also very lay friendly. So I think it's helped make it a lot more approachable for a wider audience.
Thank you.
Would you speculate on why exercise is so important? Or what are the factors, apart from feeling good about your exercise? I mean, what is it that's causing the prevention effect?
So now you've asked me something that's super true to my heart, because I've dedicated the last 30 years of my life to study physical activity and how it's related to the risk of developing cancer. And once you have cancer, how we can use exercise to help rehabilitate people and improve their coping with disease and treatment. And after cancer, how we can use exercise to improve survival. And so we've actually now been able to conduct over about 500 studies conducted around the world that have shown for up to about 13 different cancer sites that being physically active reduces your risk of developing those cancers, and that once you have cancer, that exercise can actually very much be something that a cancer patient can do during their treatment. It helps improve their quality of life and their physical function, and definitely is also now we have evidence that it improves your survival, decreases your chance of dying from your cancer. Why it actually happens so, we've also done a number of studies looking at the underlying biological mechanisms that are associated with the physical activity, and we found that there are a number of different pathways that are impacted by it. We know, for example, that physical activity helps reduce overall body weight and body fat levels, which does increase your risk of a number of different cancers. It also helps reduce things like sex hormones, metabolic hormones like insulin resistance, inflammatory markers, and so there are, and those are just some of the main pathways that seem to be impacted by physical activity. And what we've actually found that physical activity independent of body weight is actually a way of reducing your risk of cancer. So it's actually been, for me, it's actually been a fantastic field to work in, because it's actually quite an empowering thing to tell people that you can actually reduce your risk of cancer by being physically active, but also once you have cancer, by trying to maintain your activity levels, you actually improve your chances of survival and coping and improve your quality of life. So it's actually turned out to be quite an interesting area to work in.
Thank you. Very comprehensive study, and I'm interested whether you looked at rare cancers, things like cancers of unknown origin.
Yeah, so all the cancers that we looked at were the ones that we showed here. So we weren't able to look at some rare cancers because we just didn't have some of the information about what causes them. So the limitations of this study are that we were only able to look at certain exposures, certain cancers. We weren't able to look at multiple risk factors at the same time. We are doing a methods paper on that as well. And we only looked at incidence. We haven't looked at mortality either. So we weren't able to look at things like competing risks. So that's for the future.
Yeah. Congratulations on such a big and complex study and for distilling that. I realise the need to distill the messages down for that knowledge transfer. But I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about the overlaps between the different categories of attributions that you've given to certain cancer causes, such as, sedentary smoking and overweight and things like that.
For sure. Yeah. So we have.
Technically manage that.
Yeah. So we're these are like looking at individual risk factors separately, because so generally, I mean, for let's say we take physical activity and cancer, we would have taken risk estimates that were adjusted for things like, body weight or some of the other major causes of those cancers. So they are, multiple variable adjusted risk estimates. But we actually have been trying to look at multiple risk factors at the same time. And to be able to do that, we use data from the Alberta Tomorrow project, because you need to have a cohort study where you've got data on the same population and all the different risk factors for those people, and then you can look and then you can model it. And so that's a paper that we have under review right now, and we would like to be able to do that, but at the time that we did this study, we didn't have access, at least at a national level, to sufficiently detailed data on all of these different risk factors so that we could actually model all of that simultaneously. But I know that there's a group here in Australia that has done some of that work, because they've actually combined a number of Australian cohort studies, and they've been able to look at multiple risk factors at the same time. And so that would be definitely the next sort of big thing to be able to do that, because of course that they all are combined.
Yeah, and is your goal then to essentially be able to pick have a hierarchy in a way, so that if it's impossible to tackle everything, for example, what would you would be able to attribute a hierarchy?
Well, I mean, I think you can already do that a little bit with this, because it already shows the relative importance of a number of different risk factors, and recognizing that some of them will have multiple effects on different cancers. So one of the things that we are doing with this study that I didn't mention is we're working with the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, and we're using a microsimulation model called OncoSim, where we're actually using these data to model from a health economics perspective what would be the impact on the number of different intervention scenarios that we model for future impact, because I think from a government level, it'd be quite interesting to know what would be the cost savings if we could actually prevent a number of cancers from occurring.
Christine, impressive. I know in France they try to do the same thing. Isabelle Sergio around I don't know whether her list was as comprehensive as yours. And how you did that in Canada. These exercises are fairly easily exportable to other populations because you did a lot of work that could be used, is ready to be used to be applied to other populations. How easy would that be given under the hypothesis that good estimates of the prevalence of a lot of risk factors that you're mentioning here are available?
Yeah, absolutely, because you're absolutely right. The risk estimates that we used are international risk estimates, and so the risks of, I mean, we had huge discussions about this actually at the beginning about whether we should try to find risk estimates based on Canadian populations, but that was pretty much impossible to do for all of these risk factors, so we had to use international ones. And if the prevalence of the exposure is somewhat similar across the populations that you're comparing, then yes, that would be absolutely transferable. So I think for countries that are not able to go through this kind of an exercise, they can use these sorts of results to guide them. And we did obviously compare our results to other studies that have already been published here in Australia, in the UK, and there are, you know, a few that have been published from France and so on. So, and often the differences that come across in these studies are essentially some of the decisions that are made about, you know, which cancers to include. For example, on physical activity, it was not as important in Australia as it turned out in Canada because they only considered 3 or 4 cancer sites, whereas we know now that there are many, many more cancer sites that are associated. So of course that population attributable risk went up. So I think I also recognize this as a snapshot in time for 2015. For us, we've actually, working with our Alberta colleagues, we've actually updated the 2012 results that we gave them in 2014 because they also said, well, you know, these things are changing over time, and so we want to keep up in time. So this will be something that probably would have to be repeated again in a few years to see whether, you know, some of these targets that we're trying to set we're actually meeting, and whether some of the programs that we want to be able to implement to change some of these exposures are actually having the impact that we expected they might have. So. But I am very grateful that we were able to do this study because there was a huge demand from the Canadian Cancer Society and a number of agencies to have some quantifiable numbers that you can actually use when you're developing your programs and policies, and these sorts of numbers actually have some weight to them.
Thank you so much for a fantastic study. I'm really curious to find out, maybe it's leading on from the knowledge translation, but what happens next and how do you measure the success from the results of the study? Yeah, so again, with our KT team, they're absolutely totally amazing. They are tracking absolutely everything, every tweet. I mean, even if you tweet about the study today, my colleagues in Calgary or in Toronto will know about it. So we are doing an evaluation of all aspects of the study. We're evaluating how the KT products are being used. We're evaluating how the website is being used in the dashboard, how the papers are being picked up, how many government policies we might be influencing, and the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, which was an arm's length organization that was established about 15 years ago in Canada, was one of the members of our KT advisory team, and they already used data from the COMPARE study in their Canadian strategy for cancer control that they've just updated. And so it's going to obviously take a little while to figure out exactly what the impact of this study is, but we are definitely evaluating it. And as I said, we're working with CPAC right now with this microsimulation model to do the next steps, because we recognize that this was part of what we wanted to do, but we really want to look at the health economics impacts as well. So that's what we're doing next.
I'd just like to ask you all to thank Christine again for the really informative presentation. Christine, there's just a small gift from the VCCC for your wonderful talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.